Good evening and welcome to the first of two lectures on the subject of the revival of the Hebrew language. My name is Meir Bester. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Dar Chinoam and the Engage with Israel initiative that we had launched last fall. Often dealing with Israeli issues can be tense and somewhat divisive. This time it's a totally happy story. In fact, it might be called a miraculous story. How an ancient language that most of us would associate with the Bible and prayer books ended up as the official language of a nation. The Bible has no words for stock market or electricity or submarines. So the language had to had a number of challenges before it could be taken up. And knowing that the story had its roots in the 19th century Europe, I immediately thought of our old friend Kalman Weiser as somebody who might be able to illuminate this topic for us. In the years before COVID, Professor Weiser enthralled us often with intimate insights relating to the old country, Yiddish, the shtetl, and more. He really needs no introduction, but I will offer this brief summary of his position and accomplishments. Kalman Weiser is the Silbert Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies at York University and the interim director of York University Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. I hope I pronounced that properly. He is the author of several studies about Jewish nationalism and about Yiddish linguistics and culture. His book, Jewish People, Yiddish Nation, won the 2012 Canadian Jewish Book Award for Scholarship. He's presently completing a book about the relationship between Jewish scholars of Yiddish and German colleagues who served the Third Reich. We'll have to get him over here once the book is done. Professor Weiser will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll take questions. He will take questions. Please enter your questions in a chat and I will either present them on your behalf or ask you to speak for yourself. Professor Weiser, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen. Okay, let me just start it. I assume you can see it. Okay, so Mayor, just nod that you can see the screen. Okay, all right, fantastic, thank you. Okay, I'm very excited to be talking about this topic for a number of reasons. One of which I talk so much about Yiddish, but really this is the other side of the coin. The Yiddish movement and the Hebrew movement go hand in hand. They're intimately related. And for that reason, I'm really going to be talking in two parts this lecture series. The first part, I'm going to be speaking about the revival, and I'll explain what I mean by revival as we go along. Revival of Hebrew in the diaspora, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The second part of the lecture series, next week, I'm going to be talking about Ottoman Palestine, the British Mandate period, and then the current state of Israel, and how it relates to the diaspora. So that is the second part will be focused on the actual spoken revival. And the first part will be mainly on what preceded it, what made the spoken revival possible. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of a historian and someone who works in the area of linguistics a bit, not so much from the literary side of things. Particularly next time, I'm going to try and give you a real sociolinguistic insight into how what I think Mayer rightly described as a miracle happened. That is, this is the first and only time in history that a language that was no longer spoken was revived as a native language. Not only as a native language, but it's now the language of some 8 to 9 million people around the world, either as their primary language or as their secondary language, a topic I'll come back to in just a few minutes. So let me just show you what I have here, because it's symbolic. Here you have, of course, the word Ivrit, written in the contemporary Hebrew script, which goes back centuries. Under it, you have the Paleo-Hebraic script, which is derived from an ancient Canaanite Phoenician script. This is the way people used to write Hebrew a few thousand years ago. So that's the old. And of course, in the center of the screen, you've got Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's widely seen as the father of the modern Hebrew movement. I'm going to challenge this notion a bit later on, especially in the second lecture, but you've got the old and the new, and we're going to see how we got from the old to the new. Okay, now I've got to remove my face so I can actually see what's on the screen. Great. So I'd like to start with a few paradoxes. I say paradoxes in quotation marks because they're not exactly paradoxes. They're seeming contradictions that when you examine them, they're not really such great contradictions, but they're striking nonetheless. First of all, as I mentioned before, this is a sui generis event. There's never been a language that's been revived. People have tried with Latin, but they failed. If you go on to YouTube, you'll occasionally see people who speak Latin and try to go to places like Rome and communicate with the Italians in Latin and see how far they get. And of course, usually people laugh at them or think they're strange and try to speak to them in English. It hasn't worked anywhere else. It's worked to a lesser extent based on the model of the revival of Hebrew. There's been work to revive indigenous languages here in Canada, but also in places like New Zealand and a few other places around the world, but never to the same extent that Hebrew has achieved its success. And we can talk in the second lecture in part about what's different with that situation with Hebrew. As I said, nowadays, there are probably between 8 and 9 million speakers, mainly in the state of Israel, but not necessarily. As opposed to 1870, 150 years ago, when there was no one speaking Hebrew as his native language or her native language, certainly no one using it as an everyday language. Now, here's the paradox. Despite the fact that roughly half of the world's Jewish population speaks Hebrew on an everyday basis, that is the Israelis, English is really the main language of Jews. It's the international language of Jews. When Jews from two countries meet, they usually speak in English, not in Hebrew. A century or so ago, if a Jew from Morocco met a Jew from Poland, they might try and communicate in Hebrew. Nowadays, they communicate in English usually. On the other hand, Hebrew is the lingua franca of the state of Israel. Many of those speakers that I mentioned, this 8 to 9 million, are non-Jews, whether they're Arab Israelis, Palestinians, Thai guest workers, Romanians working there, whoever it is, someone from the Philippines. This is the language, when you go into the streets in Hebrew, in Israel, you find Nigerians speaking with Thais in Hebrew. So this is a strange thing. It makes you wonder, is modern Hebrew itself a Jewish language? And we'll talk about this. Is it the national language of the Jews, at least in the symbolic sense? Or is it really the language of Israelis, with Israeli being an inclusive category that's Jews and non-Jews? The last paradox I'll mention for now, again, not really a paradox, but a curious phenomenon, is that particularly since the 1960s, synagogues and day schools in North America have adopted the modern pronunciation of Israeli Hebrew. And even calling it Israeli Hebrew is among scholars a bit of a controversy, but we'll come to. What do you call the language that's spoken today in Israel? Yet the language has actually declined. Knowledge of Hebrew in the diaspora has long been on decline. Hebrew enrollments in university classes are on decline. So we have this very strange phenomenon that in the diaspora, Hebrew is very often perceived as the language of Israelis and only secondarily as the language of Jews. Or it's the religious language of Jews and the everyday language of Israelis, and English is the most widely spoken language used amongst Jews. So this is giving you a sort of sneak preview of some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. These are some of the explicit questions that we're going to be examining in the next day and today and the next week. Firstly, the question of reviving Hebrew. Is this the right term? Was Hebrew really a dead or a hibernating language that was somehow almost magically reanimated after nearly 2,000 years of slumber? Obviously, I'm going to tell you not, but the story is much more complicated than that. It's a miraculous event in the same way that, all miracles that we are miraculous until we can explain them by science. We have a pretty good sociolinguistic insight into how this phenomenon occurred and why the circumstances were unique in the land of Israel that made it possible. Secondly, what do we mean by to even revive a language? we'll see more about this, but what I mean is, in this case, making a language that no one spoke as an everyday language, that was no one's native language, making it into an everyday language for both sacred and mundane purposes, and making it into a language that children know better than any other language, that's making it into their mother tongue, so to speak. Now, the question, what we'll be talking a lot about today is why, where, and Hebrew was revived. Our focus will be Europe. The next time it'll be the land of Israel. But it's really important to understand why this was happening, as well as where and how. What were the reactions to this process? You might be familiar that not everybody was happy with this. Mayer said this is a triumph that's universally accepted. And I would say that most people are happy with it. It's a fait accompli. But not everybody to this day is happy with the revival of Hebrew. The revival of Hebrew still has its opponents. Finally, the question we'll be asking at the very end is modern Hebrew the direct continuation of traditional Hebrew? Or is it something else? Is it an animal of its own kind? And is there more than one Hebrew today? We know there's Israeli Hebrew, but if you go to a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, or even Toronto, a religious neighborhood, will they be using the same kind of Hebrew? Are there distinctions? So we'll be talking about this at the very end. Okay, so let's get to business. Firstly, some background. What is Hebrew? Hebrew begins its history as a Canaanite dialect. You, of course, remember the Canaanites, the people who live in the land of Israel. They have many dialects that are mutually intelligible, whether it's Phoenician or Moabite. The differences between them are quite small. They belong to the northwest branch of Semitic languages. What I'm showing you here is simply the various Semitic languages, not all of them, but most of them. It's not really important to know all their names. You can think of Arabic, Amharic, Hebrew. There are a few other ones. Of course, Hebrew, Amharic, and Arabic are the main ones, and Hebrew belongs to a different group than those two other languages. Now, if you read the Bible, you'll find that the language is not yet called Ivrit. It's not called Ivrit until a little bit later in Scripture. It's usually called either the language of Canaan, suggesting that the people who put the Bible together themselves saw themselves as speaking the language that people around them spoke, or eventually it's called Yehudit, Judean, because there are two kingdoms, Israel and Judea, and the people in Judea speak about their language. They call it Judean. Makes perfect sense. This is the language that we're going to call Hebrew. It's the language of most of the Bible. Of course, it's the language of the Mishnah, although biblical Hebrew and Mishnaic Hebrew are different because the language, of course, was a living language. It was evolving over time. So there are clear differences between the language of these two major texts. Now, skipping ahead, we eventually find that by Roman times, Hebrew is in the decline. It's been in the decline for a few centuries. By the first century of the Common Era, there are several languages used by the Jews of the land of Israel. They're speaking Greek, they're speaking Aramaic, which is the lingua franca of the Near East. It's the most commonly spoken language amongst Jews. You're probably familiar with the fact that Jesus and his disciples in the New Testament, they are chiefly Aramaic speakers who have a knowledge of Hebrew as a scriptural language and probably have some knowledge of Greek, but they're really Aramaic speakers. But if you went elsewhere outside of the land of Israel, into the diaspora, you'd find Jews speaking Greek in much of the Near East because Greek was widely known in the Near East, or probably speaking Aramaic. Hebrew ceases to be a native language probably sometime by the 2nd century CE. When I say ceases, I mean no one is being raised with Hebrew anymore. Hebrew continues as a liturgical language, a scriptural language, but the very last holdouts, who are probably people in rural areas, stopped raising their children in Hebrew sometime by the 2nd century of the Common Era. What do we have instead? Well, I've already mentioned languages like Aramaic. In different places, we're going to see different languages emerge in Jewish communities. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next slide. Okay, so what you're seeing on this map here is the various Jewish vernaculars, the so-called Jewish languages. Now, there are many of them. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but you're probably familiar with Yiddish as the Ashkenazic Jewish vernacular, or Ladino as the Sephardic Jewish vernacular, or Judeo-Arabic in North Africa and parts of the Middle East, in Arabic-speaking lands. There are many of these. Pretty much every pre-modern Jewish community has its own Jewish language that's distinct in some way, greater or lesser extent from the language of its non-Jewish neighbors. But they all share Hebrew. Pretty much every Jewish community has what we call a diglossic relationship between the language of sanctity, Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, and the Jewish vernacular. The one exception that is most prominent in my mind is the Jews of Ethiopia, who do not have Hebrew. They have the Bible in their own language, in their own liturgical language. But pretty much with a few other exceptions, every other Jewish community has this relationship of the holy language, which is really Hebrew plus bits of Aramaic that are fused together, what we might call rabbinic Hebrew, plus the Jewish vernacular that they usually just call it Jewish. If you ask what does Yiddish mean, it means Jewish. We speak Jewish. Everywhere people speak Jewish, they speak different Jewishes, okay? But they all have the holy language. And how does this relationship work? Well, the vernacular is the language you speak for everyday purposes. It's the language in which you write less serious things meant for an audience that's probably not educated in Hebrew. And here I'm going to use Hebrew interchangeably with Lashon Kodesh, just because it's simple. Rabbinic Hebrew is what I mean. Rabbinic Hebrew, the holy tongue, is what you use for prayer, for writing commentaries on the Torah or on the Talmud. It's the language for any serious writing. If you want to write a contract, if a yeshiva student is writing home to his parents, really to his father that is, he'll write in Hebrew, but he'll make some remarks maybe in Yiddish for the benefit of his mother. So you have this high-low divide between the unspoken language, which has great prestige, and the vernacular, which is used for less prestigious functions. But every Jewish language has a very large Hebrew component. And this is part of what we might call vertical transmission. Every Jewish language has words borrowed from the study of texts, but it also seems to be that every Jewish language is built on a prior Jewish language. So when Jews stopped speaking Hebrew, they imported Hebrew words into their Aramaic. When they stopped speaking Aramaic, they imported Hebrew words into their Arabic. When they stopped speaking Arabic and started speaking Spanish, whatever, they imported from that. So there's a continuous flow of Hebrew going back from ancient times into all Jewish languages, which will have a very important effect that's very significant with the revival of Hebrew. Just to give you a sneak preview of what I mean, when I went to Israel and began to study, and I didn't know much Hebrew, I studied a little bit of it, they gave me a placement test in Ulpan, and they were shocked how well I did. And they wanted to put me in a high level, and I said, don't put me in a high level. And they said, but why? You understand everything. And I said, because I speak Yiddish. I understand how to take all the Hebrew words in Yiddish, change the pronunciation, and make them into Hebrew words. But it's obviously not enough to speak Hebrew. Okay, so all Jewish languages have that Hebrew component. It's different from language to language, but they all have it. The high language, Hebrew, tended to be a language known by men, hence I'm calling it a male language, whereas the vernacular was everybody's language. It was very often associated with women because women did not usually have a good knowledge of Hebrew, even though they might be familiar with it from prayers, and some women might have a tutor who taught them Hebrew. But usually women did not have a good knowledge of Hebrew. In fact, very often they use a different typeface for Hebrew and for the vernacular. Okay, now I'm getting now to really want to be, and we're going to talk about the revival. This condition that I described continued for centuries until really the 18th century. There was not much what we might call secular writing going on in Hebrew for centuries. There are some exceptions, particularly in Italy, medieval Spain, but really by the modern era, I'm talking about the 18th century, Hebrew was mainly used for religious functions, and as I said, things like business contracts. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which comes in the 18th century, wants Jews to begin to break out of what they see as a cultural ghetto. They want Jews to change their relationship to the language, change their relationship to their neighbors, change their relationship to the state. They want Jews to modernize, and that means a certain degree of secularization. And there's an entire linguistic agenda which is necessary if Jews are going to be able to communicate with their neighbors and to begin to learn new things like modern science, technology, medicine, and so on, that they previously didn't have usual access to. So here's how it works. They basically want to replace the old diglossia, the old relationship between a high and a low language, with a new one. They're going to take the vernacular and replace it with the high status language of non-Jewish society. So in the case of Central Europe, where German is widely known, you're going to take Yiddish and you're going to replace it with standard German. If you're in France, that would mean replacing Yiddish with French, Yiddish with Dutch, whatever the language of the upper classes in the state is. Obviously, in Russia, they want Jews to learn Russian instead of speaking Yiddish. At the same time, they're going to keep Hebrew because Hebrew is an important classical Jewish language. But they want to expand Hebrew's functions, and they want to change the nature of Hebrew they use. The idea, and this is inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, is that there are pure languages and impure languages. And what's desirable is a pure language. Greek, Latin, and Biblical Hebrew are pure languages. Yiddish and Rabbinic Hebrew are mixed languages. They're hybrid languages, and they have to be done away with. Rabbinic Hebrew is basically the parallel to Yiddish from the Ashkenazic perspective. They're both seen as somehow corrupt. Rabbinic Hebrew should be replaced with Biblical Hebrew. That means changing the grammar, the vocabulary, and the spelling to some extent of Hebrew as it had been used by Ashkenazic Jews through the centuries. So just to give you a few small examples of what I mean, sometimes Ashkenazic Hebrew does not use the same genders for words, masculine and feminine, or the same plural forms as Biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew tends to use what we call defective spelling. If you have a word like milchama, war, you spell it mem lamed chet mem he, whereas there's a tendency in Rabbinic Hebrew to use yud and vav to indicate vowels. So you could spell milchama, milchuma, with a yud after the mem. So they want to do away with this. And there are various other examples that seem quite technical to us perhaps today, but were quite significant to them because they wanted the language to be pure. They also wanted a new pronunciation to be used. The pronunciation they wanted was Sephardic pronunciation. And I say Sephardic in quotation marks. Their inspiration was Hebrew as pronounced by the Sephardic communities of northern Germany, because you had a Sephardic community in places like Hamburg. They tended to be wealthier and more acculturated than the Ashkenazic Jews. There was also that Hebrew as used by Christian scholars was used with the Sephardic pronunciation. So the ideal was, let us pronounce Hebrew, even though it's still not a spoken language. When we pronounce it, let us pronounce it as the Christians and the Sephardic Jews do. This is more correct. It's more true to the Bible, and let us use Biblical Hebrew. The other point of all this was to pioneer new ways of writing in Hebrew, not just on religious subjects, but let's start writing modern poetry, biblical epics. Let's talk about current events, science, history. Let's write the history of great men. They begin to publish, and this you can see on the right, Ha'Ma'aseh is one of the first journals from 1781. It's one of the first journals of the Haskalah. It publishes book reviews. There's a chess column. There's poetry in it. All kinds of things that have never before been seen in Hebrew or haven't been seen for centuries, certainly not amongst Ashkenazic Jews. Now, the Haskalah begins in Central Europe, but it'll quickly spread to Eastern Europe, where the circumstances are a bit different. But the ideological thrust is much the same. Now, it's really in Eastern Europe that things take off in very interesting ways. What you're seeing here is, first of all, this is an algebra textbook. I can't see the year, it's probably about 1819, but this is an algebra textbook published in Hebrew in Vilna. On the right, you have Hatzifirah, which is one of the first Hebrew newspapers. By the 1860s, they're beginning to produce newspapers in Hebrew in Eastern Europe. Again, not as a spoken language, but this is meant mainly for men, particularly well-educated, yeshiva-trained men who are beginning to secularize, who want to know about the world around them. You also have the beginnings of Jewish newspapers in other languages, but Hebrew is really the most prestigious one in Eastern Europe. Now, as you might expect, Hebrew literature begins to take off by the by the 1860s, actually even a bit earlier, about by the 1830s, but particularly by the mid-century, it's taking off. And it's taking off for a number of reasons. One of them is the desire to secularize and have European culture available to Jews in the Jewish language. But another one, somewhat ironically, is it's a response to the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement uses both Hebrew and Yiddish to tell stories about famous Rebbes. The Maskilim, the proponents of the Haskalah, consider this idiocy. They want to satirize it, to make a mockery of it, in order to discourage Jews from following the Hasidic movement. In order to do this, they engage in a lot of satire. Sometimes the satire is so good, they imitate Hasidic literature that Hasidim don't even realize that's mocking Hasidic literature. But in doing so, they make great steps in reviving Hebrew as a modern literary language. Because of course, once you start writing in a language, you have to deal with all of its inadequacies. How do you represent speech in a language that no one's speaking? How do you talk about current events? How do you talk about the 1860s in a language that's mainly used to talk about events in antiquity? Especially if you don't want to borrow from Yiddish, Russian, or some other language. So there's a whole burst of literary energy in the 19th century in Eastern Europe out of necessity. These people are trying to write science textbooks. They're creating periodicals. They're writing new fiction. They're creating dictionaries of Hebrew. They're writing poetry, and they have to really work the language. At the same time, Yiddish is taking off as a literary language, but they have inverse problems. Hebrew has the blessing that's a respected classical language, but biblical Hebrew, which is what they want to use, only has a vocabulary of about 8,000 words. And of course, it's not suited to deal with things like telegrams and railroads of the 1860s. Whereas Yiddish, of course, is spoken, but it has low prestige. It doesn't have a 2,000-year or 3,000-year literary tradition. You have to make that into a respectable language with a literary tradition. So it has inverse problems. And in fact, many of these writers, if not most of them, are writing in Hebrew with one hand and writing in Yiddish with the other hand. They're rejuvenating both languages simultaneously. In fact, many of the Hebrew writers, such as Mendelssohn, and I'll talk about him in just a moment, end up translating their Yiddish works completely into Hebrew. And this really does a lot to make Hebrew into a modern language, because after all, they're talking about what's going on in their own day. They have to invent realistic characters with realistic dialogue, speaking the way things are going on in the 19th century. Now, of course, this necessitates creating new words to reflect the modern realities and the various European cultural forms. So you often think about, probably if you know something about the revival of Hebrew, you think about Ben Yehuda creating words. That was his main contribution. He sat and he made dictionaries and a newspaper. But words were being created in Hebrew long before Ben Yehuda. This is something that went along throughout the centuries, but it really intensifies in the 1900s, the 1800s, because they don't want to borrow, if they can avoid it, from other languages. It used to be, you read Hasidic literature. If you don't know how to say something, you say a type of fish, and then you put in, min dag, and then you put in parentheses the Yiddish name, hecht, and everybody knows you're talking about a pike. They don't want to do that. They have to figure out ways to express what they want using biblical Hebrew, which is very limiting. And this is where you see the genius. You see words like mishkafayim, the contemporary word for eyeglasses, is invented in Eastern Europe sometime, I believe, in the 1890s. And there are many other words like this that are used in contemporary Hebrew. Sometimes they simply borrowed internationalisms, words like kultura, which was eventually replaced by the word tarbut, because they decided that was a superior word. It wasn't a European word, it was a word of native stock. But you can see in the press in the 1860s on all sorts of debates. How should we say telegram? Should we say telegrama, or should we say mivrak, which eventually becomes the accepted word because it's seen as preferable of being Semitic Hebrew origin. They also experiment with style, the so-called synthetic literary style. And this is where I'll say a word about Mendelssohn. Here you see a sort of triumvirate of, or not triumvirate, you see three, I'm making reference to three people, two faces, one work. These are prominent people, but there are many others like them, but they're significant for a few reasons that I'm going to mention. That's why I'm just drawing attention to them and not everybody else. Mendele, well, let me start on the right. On the right, you have Ahavat Zion by Abraham Mapu. This is really our first Hebrew novel, written, I believe, in the 1830s. But it's interesting what Mapu did. Mapu set a romance in biblical Israel, which made sense. If you want to use biblical Hebrew, it makes sense to talk about biblical Israel. It's very hard to set a romance in the Pale settlement in 1830 using biblical Hebrew. This was a bestseller. It inspired others to try to do things like this. Eventually, they started writing novels that were set in the 19th century. And of course, they dealt with the problems I described. Some of the major contributors to advancing Hebrew as a literary idiom were on the left, you have Mendele the bookseller. In the middle, you have Achad Ha'am. Both are pen names, okay? On the left is Abramovich, and the center you have Ginsburg. But we usually call them Mendele Moicha Sfarim or Mendele Mocher Sfarim, and you call him Achad Ha'am, one of the people. Mendele is best known as the father of modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And his contribution that's so remarkable about Hebrew is that he said, listen, I cannot write in biblical Hebrew. It doesn't work. What he started to do is to go back to what rabbis had done throughout the centuries, combining the various levels of Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew, all in ways to make it flexible and in very clever ways to express popular speech. You know, Mishnaic Hebrew was the language of the common people. So let's use Mishnaic Hebrew mixed with Aramaic to represent Yiddish in a dialogue happening in the 1870s. So he created this flexible synthetic language that became very popular. Achad Ha'am is the master of the essayist. He took the European essay form and he, using his knowledge of Hebrew, of course, these are all yeshiva trained men. I mean, from these people, Hebrew might as well have been a mother tongue, even though they didn't speak it. They knew it so well. They'd grown up from the age of 3 being immersed in the sea of Hebrew. And they cared about the language. He was an amazing craftsman who made Hebrew into a modern tool for expressing political and cultural ideas, not just for literature. So really tremendous transformations that were necessary, that had to happen before people could actually start speaking Hebrew. Okay, now this brings us to our second revolution in Europe, and that's the Jewish nationalist revolution. Now, very simply, and these are things that are likely familiar to you, Jews embraced the ideal of nationalism by the late 19th century, particularly in the last quarter of the late 19th century, but even really beginning by the 1860s, that began to embrace it. And with the idea of nationalism, they embraced the idea of national monolingualism. That is, every people should speak one language, its own language. The romantic idea that language represents the national genius of a people. It's their inalienable possession. And when they lose their possession, they cease to exist as a people. They assimilate and they disappear into the woodwork. Of course, a connected idea that wouldn't be activated yet, but would be soon activated, was the idea that every people has its land, its unique land, and therefore Jews have to have their own land. In fact, Ben Yehuda was very much interested in reviving Hebrew. He went to Palestine in 1881, to Ottoman Palestine, precisely in part because he understood the only place for Hebrew that could be revived is in the Jewish land. Hebrew could not really be fully revived in the diaspora. You needed a Jewish territory for a Jewish language to be revived. But in any case, by the 19th century, we have Jews who are rejecting the ideal of using 2 languages in Jewish society, whether it's a Jewish language plus Hebrew or a non-Jewish language plus Hebrew. They want Jews to start using one language as much as possible. They want you Jews to start using Hebrew as much as possible. By the 1870s, and particularly the 1880s, we begin to get the idea of Chibat Zion, the idea of Jews settling in the land of their forefathers. This is pre-Zionist Zionism, and we'll talk more about it next time. Ben Yehuda, as I mentioned, goes in the early 1880s to Ottoman Palestine. There are others like him. It's here that they'll start reviving Hebrew as a spoken language. I'm going to talk about that at great length next time, how that actually happens, the mechanics of it. What I want to emphasize here is that there's a parallel phenomenon in Eastern Europe. The association called Safa Brura, the clear or precise Hebrew association that Ben Yehuda founds, with a few other Jews in Palestine, will be brought back to Eastern Europe. The Chibat Zion members, these proto-Zionists, will start forming circles where they'll get together over a cup of tea in someone's home in Ukraine or Belarus, wherever they are in Eastern Europe, and they'll start speaking Hebrew to each other. And some of them will even try to speak Hebrew with their children, to raise them in Hebrew. It's not wildly successful, as you can imagine, because life outside is, of course, in Yiddish and in Russian and in some other language. But they're really committed to it, and they're making an effort. We have the birth of two rival language movements by the end of the 19th century. One that asserts Yiddish as the national language of the Jews, and one that asserts Hebrew and wants the Jews to have cultural rights in either one of these languages. Above, you see a man named Nathan Biernbaum. He's one of the early Zionists before Theodor Herzl. His family lives today here in Toronto. He's the man who coined the term Zionism. He was very much a proponent of reviving Hebrew by the 1880s. He felt, like many others in his movement, that Yiddish represented the ghetto. It represented the diaspora. It was something that had to be overcome if Jews were going to revive themselves as a people. Okay. Later on, he became a Yiddishist. He gave up on Hebrew and the diaspora. And the idea of a Jewish state. What you see in the middle is the Chernovitz Conference of 1908 for Yiddish. The reason why I mentioned Chernovitz is because there was a response. About a year later, Hebraists held their own conference. They were so upset that people were declaring Yiddish a Jewish national language, they felt they had to declare publicly a position and organize themselves, galvanize their efforts to promote Hebrew as the national language of the Jews in the diaspora. What you need to understand is at this time, there was not only two movements for Hebrew and Yiddish, but Jews were also beginning to linguistically assimilate. They had become German speakers and other speakers in Central Europe, and they were increasingly becoming Russian speakers and Polish speakers and speakers of other languages in Eastern Europe. So there was a real perceived need, at the same time that Hebrew was being revived, that Hebrew was also on the decline, that it was threatened by other languages. Okay, so this, of course, mobilized ideology. Now, a significant turning point in this story is World War I and the interwar period. This is really what's quite shocking and amazing as far as I'm concerned. By the late 19th century, we have something called the Cheder Metukan. That is the reformed Cheder. In the Ashkenazic pronunciation, it's the Cheder Mesikin, which means the dangerous Cheder. And that's the term its opponents use for it. The Cheder Metukan's idea in the Russian Empire was to take the traditional cheder, where boys learn from a young age, they learn only religious subjects, to start teaching them secular subjects like mathematics, Russian grammar, maybe geography, things that could be useful in life alongside traditional subjects. And they started in some places to do this in Hebrew. In Palestine, they had already pioneered the Ivrit be'Ivrit method, the immersion method that I'm going to talk about next week. This is based on the Berlitz method, if you're familiar with it. Ben Yehuda had learned this before he came to Palestine. He knew that in the Berlitz schools of Europe, they were teaching French through French immersion or German through German immersion. Why can't we do this with Hebrew? This, of course, is the basis of today's Ulpan. They started doing this in the cheder, in small numbers of the cheders in Eastern Europe. Again, it wasn't hugely successful, but it helped to intensify the popularity of the idea of revitalizing Hebrew as a spoken language. The fact of the matter is this was illegal. The Tsarist authorities did not allow this. And traditional Jews were opposed to this. Traditional Jews, what we might call Haredi Jews, felt that anybody trying to speak Hebrew was a secularist. They weren't so much concerned at first about speaking Hebrew. That itself was not the problem. After all, through the generations, there had always been Jews who occasionally spoke Hebrew. It was a language that a Jew who didn't have a common language with another Jew might speak upon encountering him. There were some families in Eastern Europe who spoke Hebrew at home during Shabbat. For one day a week, it's the holy day, we speak a holy language. That certainly wasn't the norm, but it existed. But what was really so worrisome to the Haredim at this point, by the late 19th century, is that these are secular people trying to use Hebrew for non-traditional secular purposes, and they would be virulently opposed to this revival and to this new kind of education. We have a language war that begins to arise by the early 20th century between the proponents of Hebrew and Yiddish that comes to a head during World War I. Why during World War I? Because the German authorities who occupy Poland and Lithuania and other parts of Eastern Europe give Jews and other peoples the rights to use their language and the rights to create secular co-educational schools in those languages. Now, we think of Hitler in World War II, but as one thing, it's horrible, but World War I was in many ways a liberating experience for the Jews of Eastern Europe, particularly culturally. So we have the first legal schools during World War I being created not only in Yiddish, but in Hebrew. And there was a war, of course, as you can imagine, for funds. To what language school should the funds go? Parents disagreeing, Haredi officials condemning both schools as dens of secularism and inequity. 1919, after World War I, we have the National Minorities Treaties that explicitly say that Jews and other peoples have rights to their own cultures in the various multi-ethnic states of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And this includes the right to schools in their language where sufficient numbers of children exist. How does this translate? Well, the minorities treaties are never fully honored, but they're honored enough that we have the first network of widespread Hebrew language schools in the interwar period. These are the Tarbut schools. It's no longer kultura. Kultura is out. Now the word tarbut, meaning culture, is in Hebrew. What you're seeing here is a poster from, it's a propaganda poster. It says, support the Tarbut schools. It's from Poland. You have these throughout Eastern Europe. What is the Tarbut school? It's a school where children, both boys and girls, study everything you'd study in a modern school, from gymnastics to science to literature, all in spoken Hebrew. And of course, this spoken Hebrew is not the traditional pronunciation that Ashkenazic Jews use. It's the modern pronunciation that's being pioneered in Ottoman Palestine and then British Mandate Palestine that we're going to talk about next week. How successful is this school? Well, you have to take this in the bigger consideration. About 65% of Jewish children in interwar Poland attend Polish state schools because they're free. And Jewish schools tend to be harassed by the state. However, of that 35% of Jewish children who attend Jewish day schools, a full 25% of them go to the Tarbut schools. And some go to a mixture of Polish and Hebrew schools. In other words, it's a very attractive option for Jewish children, particularly Jewish children of the bourgeoisie. These schools charge tuition. It's mainly the middle-class Jews who send their children to the Tarbut schools, but there's a significant number who are going. About 45,000 Jewish children are receiving a full day's education in Hebrew by 1939. They're learning Hebrew so well, and I'll give you the example Maya gave me yesterday, and I'll give you the example of my wife's grandparents. When they came to Israel later on in life, they arrived speaking perfect Hebrew. The joke in my wife's family was that her grandparents spoke better Hebrew than the native Israelis because they'd had a classical Hebrew education. Now, of course, the problem with this Hebrew education, and this is what I'm going to talk about, the problems of the reviving Hebrew in the diaspora. One of the problems is what do you learn at a Tarbut school? You learn everything in Hebrew, a language which really doesn't work outside the school. A language which you can't get a job in, right? It's not very practical in the diaspora. The other thing about the Tarbut schools is they taught some practical skills like locksmithing and things like this, but the whole goal was to teach you to become a chalutz, to be an oleh, to go to the land of Israel. You're learning not the geography of Poland so much, you're learning the geography of the land of Israel. You're learning the literature of the land of Israel, Jewish literature, and so on. You're not being prepared for life in the diaspora. As you can imagine, once it became possible for Jews to go to Palestine in the interwar period, graduates of Tarbut schools went in large numbers. So it was, in a sense, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is one of the problems. Hebrew culture was on the rise and on the decline at the same time because its successes led to people leaving. The great writers, and here you see Bialik and Chernyakhovsky, they were leaving Europe and going to the land of Israel. there stopped being a daily Yiddish newspaper, a daily Hebrew newspaper in Poland by the 1920s, or the late 1920s. There were still books and journals and so on published. People wanted to read newspapers and as much literature coming out of the land of Israel. The diasporic Jewish culture was not as attractive as the Eretz-Yisrael Jewish culture, Hebrew culture. So that's one problem. Another problem, of course, is what you might expect: the weight of numbers, the force of habit. It's very difficult to revive a language in a sea of people who speak other languages. You know, you go into the streets, you speak another language, you speak to your parents in another language. You really have to isolate yourself for this language revival to succeed. And the conditions are obviously not really conducive to this in the diaspora. Secondly, there is as I said before, the discouragement of the larger society and the various social pressures. It's completely impractical. People think you're insane. You have to be a zealot in the eyes of most people to do this. It's not going to get you a job. It's probably not going to get you even a date unless you're dating someone who belongs to a Zionist youth group. There's religious opposition that I mentioned that's quite fierce. Of course, even as much as the language has advanced, there's still the problem of lack of terminology. Someone reminded me that even here in North America, in the Hebrew camps, in the 1980s, in the 70s, 60s, and so on, as they still continue to exist, they were still inventing terminology because not all their terminological needs had yet been met. Okay, I mentioned already there was, of course, the competition of other languages. Jews were increasingly speaking Polish. Yiddish had a successful literary movement, but the main competition, of course, was Polish and Russian in Eastern Europe. Okay, I'm going to skip coining new words, and I'm going to talk about it next time because that's a complicated thing. And I'm just going to, I wanted to mention one more thing that I see I don't have here that's very significant. Hebrew was flourishing in a certain sense in Poland, within limitations. But in the Soviet Union, where the other half of the Jews of Eastern Europe live, Hebrew really dies out. Why does it die out? Because the Soviets take a policy of persecuting Hebrew. In the early 20s, the Soviets tolerate Hebrew, especially if Hebrew was used to promote Soviet communist ideology. And we, in fact, have communist journals from the early 1920s published in Hebrew in the Soviet Union. But by the late 1920s, the Zionist movement is fully outlawed. Hebrew is portrayed as the language of the clergy and the bourgeoisie. It's the enemy of the working people. It's a tool of British imperialism. So Hebrew is effectively a language silenced. So Lithuania and Poland are strongholds of Hebrew, although they're in competition. Hebrew was out of the picture in Russia, except in secret. There are people still writing underground, trying to speak Hebrew in underground, but as you can imagine, that is not a phenomenon that can continue long-term in the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop there with Eastern Europe for today. What I'm going to tell you is what I'm going to just give you a hint of what I'm talking about next time. Next time, we're really going to see the nitty-gritty of how Ben Yehuda, and more importantly, the Jews who lived in agricultural settlements in the land of Israel from the 1880s on, how they actually revived the language, how they did it through the agency of schools and children particularly, the mechanism of making new words, the problems they face from immigration, from politics, and how this whole process has been received outside of the land of Israel, which is itself an interesting story, but I won't go into that deeply for now. So with that, I'm going to stop for tonight, and I'm very happy to entertain your questions and your comments.
Well, if anybody has a question, you might as well speak up. It's really, there's so much information here. I find it's hard to think of questions. I know I'll get 10 of them in about an hour or two when my mind will digest them all.
It's really a remarkable story to the extent to which Hebrew was not only not a dead language in the diaspora for thousands of years, but to the extent to which people really reworked it, particularly in the 19th century, into a flexible modern tool to express the realities of contemporary life. I mean, there are so many Hebrew writers that even in Israel have been forgotten. You know, I'll tell you an anecdote that I think is significant that I completely forgot to mention. When I was, to get help with my Hebrew in Israel, someone said, speak to my niece. She has no other language other than Hebrew. She's something like she's 16, go speak with her. So I see a question, I'll just finish my story. So I met with her and I was helping her to prepare for her Bagrut. The Bagrut is the Matura exam you take at the end of high school. And I said to her, what language did Bialik speak with his mother? And her answer was Hebrew. And I said, what do you mean Hebrew? Don't you realize no one was speaking Hebrew in 1860, 1870, 1880? And then she thought twice and she said, he must have been speaking Russian. And it became clear to me how much Hebrew is completely natural to native Israelis, how much they can't imagine a time when this was not the case, when we know this is actually a very recent phenomenon. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about next time is is Hebrew really Hebrew? Or is it something else? By some arguments, Hebrew is not exactly the traditional Hebrew that we know it, although traditional Hebrew plays a role in the story. Okay, so I see some hands up, so I'm happy to take the questions. Mayor, do you want to moderate?
I don't see the hands up.
Okay, I see Fridel's hand, if I'm saying it correctly, Fridel, and I see Joel's hand. And I see Esther Enkin wrote something in the chat.
I have an easy question, actually, Kalman. My
Yes.
question is the familiarity of Hebrew letters in Yiddish, I think would have made a lot of people comfortable with reading the language because you don't have to learn a whole new alphabet. And I believe Yiddish is written the same way Hebrew is. I'm not literate in Yiddish. I just wanted to know what you think the impact of that was in the gradual development of Hebrew language literacy in the diaspora.
Certainly for the people who were Yiddish speakers, it helped a lot, obviously. And this is something we can talk more about next time. The fact that there's this huge Hebrew component in Yiddish that they were already familiar with. It didn't help, obviously, for people who were coming from Russian or some other language to Hebrew. I have relatives who came from Romania into Israel in the 1970s, and they came in their 40s. They never adjusted to writing. They spoke Hebrew fluently, but they always preferred to read in Latin letters. In fact, there were some suggestions, a number of suggestions, in fact, that Hebrew be written in Latin letters. Jabotinsky, the famous Zionist, the head of revisionist Zionism, for example, said, listen, if we want to be a world language and we want to be a people amongst peoples, and we want to facilitate learning this language by immigrants, then we should really write this in Latin letters. But certainly part of the attraction of Hebrew for traditional Jews and part of the ease in learning it comes from using the same alphabet, absolutely.
My question, I'm trying to think of if I was in the Haskalah, if we were a group in Haskalah time in the 1860s or whatever, 1830s, we're embracing modernity and science and literature and culture. Most people in Haskalah would not be so religious. Maybe they were knowledgeable of the Torah and Tanakh. I just wonder why they would choose Hebrew, which only had 8,000 words, as you say, in biblical Hebrew, when I'm trying to think if they were trying to please the Christian majority, that somehow the Bible written in Hebrew was somehow more, even though they weren't religious en masse. I'm trying to understand why were they looking down on Yiddish as something spoken by lower class Jews, and where were they trying to appeal to the majority Christian who would respect? I'm trying to understand.
The answer is all of the above, but with a correction. First of all, it's a great misunderstanding to think all the Maskilim were not religious. Most of them were religious. Only later, when you really get to the Jewish nationalists, do you start to get non-religious ones. The Haskalah kind of phased into Jewish nationalism, and that's a whole other discussion that would take us time by the 1860s. But think of Moses Mendelssohn, the founder of the Haskalah, who really pioneers this linguistic ideology. He was a very observant Jew. And this is true of most of the other Maskilim, particularly in Eastern Europe. They may have been ex-Hasidim, and the standard for being Hasidic versus being what we might call religious today was different. But by today's standards, these were people who kept Shabbat. We're not talking about the writers like Bialik and so on, who smoked, and the Hada'am, who smoked cigarettes on Shabbat. But more importantly, they had grown up in the yeshiva world, as we might call it today. For them, Hebrew was the language. It was the language of being a man. It was the language of prestige. It was the language of being a Jew. So this was extremely intertwined with their identities. To be a modern person meant using your own language to express the modern world, not using somebody else's language. Of course, the fact that it was respected by Gentiles helped. Yiddish was not respected by Gentiles, and Jews internalized this prejudice against Yiddish. And this is one of the reasons they wanted to get away from Yiddish and to get away eventually from Ashkenazi Hebrew. And we'll talk more about this next time, because Ashkenazi Hebrew has the sounds of Yiddish. I'll probably play you Hatikva next time. You can hear Hatikva in the original Ashkenazic pronunciation. You probably, of course, know it in the modern Hebrew pronunciation. So much poetry was written in the 19th century and even the early 20th century for Ashkenazic Hebrew. The rhymes no longer work in modern Hebrew, in Israeli Hebrew. But that was a process in itself. Okay, so I hope I answered that question. I see something about Joseph Pearl. I'll say just something about that. Joseph Pearl was a maskil from Galicia who wanted to expose Hasidim, and he actually denounced them in writing about them in German to Austrian authorities. He wrote a famous book called The Revealer of Secrets. It was an epistolary novel from about 1819, I forget the year. What he did was he wrote what sounded like an exchange of letters between Hasidim in Hasidic style Hebrew. The whole idea was to mock how ridiculous the ideas of Hasidism were, but people thought it was an actual Hasidic novel. But he was a good example of the use of satire as a way of reviving the Hebrew language and contributing to it, making it a more flexible language. Someone's asking about more about the impetus for the revival in the early part of the 19th century. The revival is a little
that in your last
okay.
answer, actually.
Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, my father studied at Satma Yeshiva, and still they created groups to study modern history, etc. Yes, but that's the 20th century, isn't it? Right. When we get to the interwar period, the whole story of what they're doing in the Orthodox world shifts. It's very interesting to see by the interwar period how the Orthodox movement, particularly the Agudat Yisrael and the groups associated with it, start to use all the modern paraphernalia that we're familiar with, newspapers, political parties, and so on. They don't stick in the past. But in the 1890s, it's the secularizers who were doing this first, and they're often being condemned by the religious. According to Marty Lakshan, the Reform movement was born of the Haskalah. Yes, the Reform movement was born of the Haskalah, and so was modern Orthodoxy. Pretty much most modern movements are born of the Haskalah, but there's no contradiction there, as I see it at least.
So this question could be more appropriate for next week, but maybe just kind of a thought about it. You mentioned about English as being the most common language where Jews from disparate countries might communicate in. I listen to Israeli television and news primarily, and the amount of English expressions that is inserted into the Hebrew dialogue in the newsrooms is astounding. Zelo relevanti. This
Right.
is not relevant.
Right.
And
Right.
expressions like end of day and by the end of and many more. And I wonder what that means, that Hebrew has reached a place where we're comfortable in the Hebrew and we're starting to borrow common expressions from other languages. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's precisely that. I think it's important to understand that Hebrew has become completely natural. There are anxieties expressed in contemporary Israel about the future of the language, the fear that the language is going to disappear. But it's precisely the same fear that they have in Sweden or Norway or any other small country, that's trying to protect its language. English is everywhere. I was watching Netflix last night. I have this bad habit of watching Netflix at bedtime, watching some bad German mystery, and half of their sentences are in English because English is attractive, right? But really, this is in no way dangerous for the language. Remember, Hebrew, before Hebrew was revived, even ancient Hebrew was always absorbing words. We think of so many words that we call Hebrew are from Greek origin or Persian origin. A word like behemoth is a Persian origin. This is the way natural languages develop. They, of course, begun to be pronounced the Hebrew way. Their meanings may shift over time. So I don't think this is a subject of concern, but certainly it's not the Hebrew that Ben Yehuda wanted. That's for sure.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question?
I have another question. One of the joys for me as a mathematician of Hebrew is the structure, the shoresh, and how from one shoresh you can make so many words. And certainly I understand that after Ben Yehuda, there's committees in Israel deciding on, what should be the word for some new concept. Was that happening in Europe in the Hasidic?
Yeah, they were not many. There were writers, of course, who were, creating new words. That's one thing. But
they didn't have committees discussing.
They had their own committees. But one of the interesting transformations that's happening, it's a bit hard to tell this story in one conclusive whole, and that's why I broke it into two parts. But the division is artificial. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. The left hand is Europe, the right hand is Eretz-Yisrael. By the interwar period, they want teachers from Eretz-Yisrael. They are, they're looking there as a model. But before then, they have to rely on their own tools. They have their own school, teachers and so on committees to try and develop, terminology. So this language enrichment project is happening all the time on both sides of the Mediterranean, so to speak, if that's the right body of water.
But you need like a standard body or a central repository. Here we have a new word for tarbut or telegram or radio, and then disseminate it out. That didn't exist until much later.
So there are various committees. In Ottoman Palestine, eventually they get a little bit better at centralizing the committees, but we're talking about very few people. It's really later on that these things, particularly in the interwar period, that these things become better organized. When Hebrew has and this is again a topic for next time, when Hebrew effectively has state power in the interwar period. In British Mandate Palestine. But you've got little groups of people working together. It's not, until you have a state, you don't have central organizations really. You might have a few, but it's not fully centralized. Yeah. I see some questions in the chat. Mayor, should I address them, or I don't know how we are for time?
I think we can go another 5 minutes. There's a question about whether any actions against Jews like pogroms or Inquisition resulted in was the response to that an attempt to promote Hebrew.
Let me see if I can see the question because I'm not sure I understand it. I'm wondering. I'm not well versed in Are they a cause or effect of the revival of Hebrew starting in the early 1800s? No, I mean, the revival of Hebrew is not directly linked to pogroms or other traumas. Of course, in a sense, not directly at least, Jewish nationalism is in many ways connected to anti-Semitism and to the trauma of pogroms. So in that sense, in that violence helped to galvanize Jewish national identity, it fed into the revival of Hebrew. But it was not, a sort of direct consequence in the revivers' minds that there are, violence leads us to want to revive the Hebrew language, if that's what you mean. I'm not sure that's what you mean, though. I mean, I think it's hard for us to understand, especially English speakers, the extent to which Hebrew occupied pride of place in Jewish minds for centuries. Even when Jews didn't speak Hebrew or didn't know it well, Hebrew was an extremely important language, and this was a source of prestige in Jewish society. People who, when you became a Hebrew writer, and I think this illustrates the point, these people like Ahad Ha'am and Bialik and so on, they didn't know Hebrew because they'd systematically taken Hebrew 1, Hebrew 2, Hebrew 3 for 20 years in Jewish day schools. They knew Hebrew extremely well because they'd gone to Cheder and Yeshiva, where they were immersed day in, day out, all day long in Hebrew texts. That's how they knew the language so well. It was an everyday part of their lives. And, you needed that in order for Hebrew to be revived. Hebrew, what we're going to see next week is the revival of Hebrew was a compromise between people who knew Hebrew extremely well and people who didn't know Hebrew at all or knew it poorly. If Hebrew had been revived exclusively by people like Bialik, we'd be speaking a different Hebrew today.
Well, sounds like a wonderful introduction to what's going to happen next week. And if there are no other questions, I think we can thank Professor Weiser for this intriguing beginning and look forward to see how it all ended. Unfortunately, there's a spoiler alert here, and we know how it ended, but I'm sure there's some machinations that we are not aware of and would be very interesting to hear. So 7:30 next week, I'll make sure.
Your Rabbi Rena had a question. She had it in the chat, and I think we missed it.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Do you want to unmute?
Thank you. So I was wondering how Yiddish writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer were received.
How were they received by Hebrew writers? Received by whom?
By those who wanted the revival of Hebrew and to get away from Yiddish. Yet he was very prolific, very talented, very honored and awarded.
The relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish literatures is complicated, and this is, like a whole other lecture because it evolves over time. Remember, everybody is coming out of the same background pretty much. Most of the early Yiddish writers were also Hebrew writers. One of the reasons why the Chernovitz conference wasn't the success people hoped to be in 1908 was there was a controversy. People couldn't bring themselves to declare Yiddish the national language of the Jewish people because they said, what about Hebrew? As much as they were pro-Yiddish, they were also pro-Hebrew. That's why Yiddish was declared a national language. So there was a language war that divided people, but many people felt strongly attached to both languages, and most writers read the other language too. Even if you were Bashevis and you only wrote in Yiddish, you were influenced by the trends in Hebrew literature because you read it also. It's really one literature, two languages. So of course, the Hebrew writers thought, a mature man shouldn't be spending all this time writing in Hebrew, and they condemned it. That was certainly the attitude in the late 19th and early 20th century. By the mid-20th century, the interwar period, the 20s and the 30s, you're really looking at Hebrew writers seeing Yiddish either as a competitor, we're competing for the same eyes, or they understood. They understood that they're writing in another Jewish language, and this is part of one literature. The contempt for Yiddish continued to exist among some people, but for most people, I would say that at least increasingly, there was an understanding of we're serving different audiences there and here, or we're competing for the same readers, not that Yiddish was somehow illegitimate. Maybe it's less legitimate than Hebrew. Hebrew is the prized language as far as they're concerned, but the prestige of Yiddish also rose. I'll make a point that I think is, I should have made earlier, but it's always good to make. When you think about the Zionist movement and its congresses, people would get up and make speeches in the early 20th century, the interwar period in Hebrew, but no one understood them. Or at least most of the people attending the conference didn't understand them, but they made these speeches as a matter of, symbolic, right? Nahum Sokolov would get up and speak for an hour in wonderful Hebrew, and no one knew what he was saying until he was translated into the protocols. What did they actually speak when they wanted to get something done? They spoke something called Kongress Deutsch. What is Kongress Deutsch? Kongress Deutsch is Yiddish attempting to be German. They'd speak an ad hoc language somewhere between Yiddish and German, because that's what most people knew at these conferences. The Zionist movement mainly had to rely on Yiddish and German in the diaspora. You can't dismiss those languages when the only way to make, Israel as a state work is you have to actually mobilize Jewish languages. So you understand you couldn't completely by this time, by the 20s and 30s, dismiss languages like Yiddish either.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Oh,
so
okay.
Thank you again. We'll make
Yeah.
sure that we have the right link in what's on, and see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure for me to speak about Hebrew, so I don't get to do it often. So thank you for coming. Good night.